So today we'll see in detail about pollination. So what do you mean by pollination and what is the need for pollination? Why pollination should occur in plants? So pollination is the transfer of the pollen grain from anther to the stigma, right? So that is the pollination. So why the pollination should happen? We saw about the formation of male gametes, right? Male gamete and also about the female gamete. So how the male gamete is produced? We saw the structure of pollen grains and then the generative cells, it forms the two male gametes and the female gamete of it, that is the embryo sac. We saw the production of egg, right? So this male gamete and the female gamete both are non-motile. That is, they cannot move. So then how the fusion will happen if both the male gamete and the female gamete are not motile? So how the fusion of male gamete and the female gamete can take place? So they need the transfer or the agents that help in the transfer, right? So those agents are called the pollinating agents. So that is the need for pollination. That is the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to the stigma, right? So that is the pollination. So only with the help of pollination makes the fertilization can happen. So today we are going to see in detail about the types of pollination and about the agents of pollination and outbreeding devices. So what are outbreeding devices? So what are the steps that the plants take, or the plants are adapted to certain features so that the cross pollination occurs? So we are going to see about the different devices or the strategies that are adapted by the plants. Okay, so first we'll see about the types of pollination. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the pistil. So we saw about the structure of pistil, that is the stigma, style and the ovary, right? So it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the pistil. So there are different types of pollination based on the source of pollen. Based on the source of pollen in the sense, so from where the pollen is transferred. For example, in the case of autogamy, so there are three types of pollination. One is autogamy, second one is jejunogamy, and third one is xenogamy. So what is autogamy? That is, it is self-pollination. So we'll see in detail about these three types of pollination and how they are occurring in plants. Okay. So the first one is autogamy or self-pollination. So what do you mean by the term self-pollination? That is, the transfer is within the flower, right? So this is the structure of the flower. So this is the stigma, that is the female reproductive part, pistil, and this is the male reproductive part, anther, and this is the filament, right? So what is happening in autogamy? Here the anthers are transferred. That is, the pollens are transferred from the anther to the stigma within the same flower. So it is happening within the flower. So it is called self-pollination. So this is more important. That is of the same flower. It is a transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. So in flowers with exposed anthers and the stigma, complete autogamy is rather rare. So what does it mean? For example, if the autogamy has to take place, there must be a synchrony. That is, the pollen release and the stigma receptivity both should happen simultaneously. That is, whenever there is a release of pollen, and also the stigma has to accept the pollen, right? So it requires the synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity. Okay. Also, anthers and stigma should be close to each other. So only if they are close to each other, there occurs a transfer of pollen. Okay. So autogamy in flowers requires synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity. So whenever there is a release of pollen, it should be accepted by the stigma, right? So this is the autogamy or self-pollination. So in plants like viola, that is in some plants like viola, oxalis, and camelina. So in all these plants, it produces two types of flowers. That is, one is called chasmogamous flowers and another one is called the clistogamous flowers. So what are chasmogamous and clistogamous? So if here the same plant will have two types of flowers, chasmogamous and clistogamous. Okay. So what do you mean by chasmogamous? That is, they have the exposed anthers and stigma. That is, their anthers and stigma will be open, right? They are similar to flowers of other species with exposed anthers and stigma. So they will be open. So, but if you take the clistogamous flowers, so this is the clistogamous flowers which are under. So this is open anthers and stigma. In the case of clistogamous flowers, here it is closed. So this is, but both types of flowers will be present in the same plant, right? So in the case of clistogamous flowers, they do not open at all. That is, they will always be closed. But so how the fertilization, pollination is happening? The anthers and stigma lie close to each other. So they are lying close to each other. So obviously, what type of pollination will happen? Only autogamous pollination can happen because they do not open at all. Only the anther and stigma are lying close to each other. So only type of pollination that is possible is autogamous. So when anthers dehisce in the floral buds, the pollen grains, they come in contact with the stigma for pollination. So whenever the dehiscence occur, the pollen grains, they come in contact with the stigma for pollination. So this is the only way of pollination that can occur in clistogamous plants, that is autogamy, right? So here, if we take the clistogamous plants, they produce assured seed set even in the absence of pollinators. So how the pollination is happening in clistogamous plants? So here they are closed, right? So since the clistogamous plants are always closed, so here there is no role of pollinators. So the pollination is always self-pollination, that is autogamy. So and there is an assured seed set. So because it is happening within the flower. Okay. So this leads to inbreeding depression. So what do you mean by inbreeding depression? As the breeding is happening within the same flower, it leads to the reduced fertility. It leads to reduced fertility. Okay. So that is inbreeding depression. So as a autoclistogamous plants, they do not open at all. So the only possible mode of pollination is autogamous. So here the anthers and stigma, they lie close to each other. And so when the anthers dehisce, the pollen grains, they come in contact with the stigma. And as a result, the pollination happens. But the disadvantage is it leads to inbreeding depression as the fertilization is occurring within the flower, right? And there is no need of pollinators in the case of clistogamous flowers. Then the next type of pollination is zytonogamy. So what do you mean by zytonogamy? Here there occurs the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. So here also it is happening within the same plant, but only difference is not within the same flower, but they are between the different flowers, right? Different flowers, but of the same plant. The same plant, right? So that is the difference. There, in the case of autogamy, it is within the same flower, but here it is between the different flowers of the same plant. So here it is functionally a cross-pollination. So instead of self-pollination, here cross-pollination happens involving a pollinating agent. Okay, but it is genetically similar to autogamy. If you see the genetical structure, because both are from the same plant. There it is from the same flower and here it is from the same plant, but genetically it is similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. Okay, so genetically, if you see, it is similar. So the next type of pollination is xenogamy. So it is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. So there we saw that different flowers of the same plant, but here it is from different plants, right? So what is A? This is what is represented here. A, that is within the same flower, and B, this is autogamy. It is happening within the flower. This is B, that is zytonogamy, which is between the different flowers of the same plant. But C is xenogamy, that is the pollen is transferred from B to C, that is between different plants, right? The transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma, that is anther of this plant, is transferred to the stigma of this plant. So this is zytonogamy and this is xenogamy. Okay, so it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different plant. So it brings genetically different pollen grains to the stigma. So it leads to variation. Okay, so here they are within the same plant, but here the xenogamy, it brings the genetically different pollen grains to the stigma. Okay, I hope you are clear with the types, right? So there are three types of pollination. One is autogamy, zytonogamy, and xenogamy. So now I'll see in detail about the agents of pollination. That is, what are the agents which bring about the pollination, right? So they are abiotic agents and biotic agents. So under abiotic agents, we are going to see about the wind and the water as an agent, and under biotic agents we are going to see about the different agents like insects, birds, bats, primates, and then arboreal rodents, that is those that are living in the trees, and reptiles. They also act as an agent for pollination. Okay, so what is the term for the pollination by wind? So if the pollination is happening by wind, it is called anemophily, right? The pollination is happening by wind, it is called anemophily. And if it is happening by water, so what is the term? It is called hydrophily, right? And if it is by animals, it is called zoophily. And by different animals, for example, if it is by insects, it is called entomophily. And if it is by birds, it is called ornithophily. And if it is by bats, if they lead to pollination, then it is chiropterophily. And if it is by ants and termites, they are called myrmecophily. Myrmecophily. And if it is by snail, it is called malacophily. And if it is by snake, it is called ophophily. So these are by the different agents. So water and wind, they come under the abiotic factors, and all these they come under biotic factors. Okay, so these are the different terms for the pollination by animals. That is, by wind it is anemophily, by water it is hydrophily, and by animals it is zoophily. If it is by insects, it is entomophily. If it's by birds, it is ornithophily, and by bats it is chiropterophily, and ants and termites it is myrmecophily. Snail it is malacophily, and by snakes it is phoeophily. Okay, you're clear, right? So first we'll see in detail by the pollination by wind. So if you take the abiotic factor, it is the most common abiotic agent which brings about pollination, right? So pollination by wind is also called anemophily, and it is the most common abiotic agent. So what are the features of the wind pollinated flowers? That is, they will have a single ovule. If you take the ovary of these flowers, they will have a single ovule in each ovary. And numerous flowers, they are packed into one inflorescence. So many flowers will be packed to form an inflorescence in the case of wind pollination, right? So example is the corn cob. Here the tassels. So what is a tassel? It is a male inflorescence in some of the plants, particularly in corn, they are called the tassels, right? The tassels are the stigma and style which wave in the wind. So here if you see the corn cap, they will wave in the wind to trap the pollen grains. So here the pollination is happening by wind, right? So this is a specific feature that they wave in the wind to trap the pollen grains. So wind pollination is quite common in grasses. Okay. So if you take the plants in which the pollination is happening by wind, they produce large amount of pollen. So what is the purpose of it? Because only if the pollen amount is large and they can easily spread, right? Because most of it will be wasted. So, and it will be easily spread and will get stick to the stigma. So they should produce large amount of pollen, and the pollen grains are light and non-sticky. So if it is heavy, it cannot be carried by the wind. So the pollen grains are generally light and they are non-sticky. So if it is sticky, also it cannot be carried by the wind and it will stick to the particular surface. So they are non-sticky and they are light, and they often possesses an well exposed stamens. So the stamens are exposed and there occurs an easy dispersal of pollens into the wind currents. Okay, so these are the special features of the pollen which are pollinated by the wind, and they have the large feathery stigma. So the stigma should be large. Why the stigma should be large? Because so that the pollen can come and stick on it easily. So it should have the large feathery stigma to trap the airborne pollen grains. So these are the special features. So you should be clear with the features of the different pollen grains, that is those that are pollinated by wind. Wind means these are the specific features, and what are the features of those pollens in which the pollination occurs by water. So each and every type of pollen have the specific features. So by wind means they are produced in large amounts and they are light and non-sticky, and they possess well exposed stamens and large feathery stigma, right? So next is the pollination by water. So here the pollination by water is called hydrophily, and it is very rare, and it is particularly limited only to 30 genera that water pollination is happening. Mostly they are monocotyledons. So these monocotyledons are pollinated by water. So examples are Vallisneria, Hydrilla in freshwater, and Joschira in marine sea grasses. Okay, so these are the examples for the plants which are pollinated by water. So, but in lower plants, water is a regular mode of transport for the male gametes. That's what we studied even in 11th standard, right? In bryophytes and pteridophytes and all, they'll grow only in places where the water is there, or only in the banks, right? So what is the purpose of it? Because they need water for the transport of the male gametes for fertilization. Right, so the distribution of some bryophytes and pteridophytes is limited because they need water for the transport of male gametes, and so for the fertilization to occur, they need water, right? But in case of Vallisneria, so in Vallisneria, the female flower actually it reaches the surface of water by a long stalk. So they have a long stalk. The purpose of long stalk is so that they can reach the surface of water, and where the male flowers or the pollen grains are released onto the surface of the water. So they are carried by the water currents and they reach the female flowers. So the female flowers will be present on the surface, right? So they are present on the surface, and these male flowers or the pollen grains will be released, and they are carried by the water currents and they reach the female flowers. But in the case of seagrass, what is happening? These female flowers are submerged in water. So they are present under the water. So there the pollen grains are long and ribbon-like. So they can enter. So here the female flowers came, they are coming to the surface, but here the pollen grains are long and they are carried inside the water and they reach the stigma. So if the fertilization or the pollination is happening outside, it is called epihydrophily, and if it is happening inside, that is called the hypohydrophily. Hydrophily is a general term which is for the pollination, the help of water, right? So if it is happening on the surface, it is epihydrophily, and if it is happening inside the water, it is hypophily. So the special features of these pollen grains are the pollen grains of most of the water pollinated species. They have a mucilaginous covering to protect from wetting, because they are always present in water, right? So they have the mucilaginous covering or coating to protect from wetting. And not aquatic plants, they use hydrophily. So what does this mean? Even though they are present in water, they are aquatic plants. They do not use water as a pollinating agents, because some of the plants like water hyacinth and water lily. So in these cases, the flowers actually, they emerge above the level of the water. If you see the plants, many of the flowering plants which are present in the water, right, they are present on the surface. So here they do not depend on the water for pollination, but they depend on the insects or the wind, that is entomophily by insects or anemophily by wind, right, or insect. So not all the plants, they use water as an, not all the aquatic plants particularly, they use water as an pollinating agent, but they use insect or the wind as an pollinating agent. Okay, so what are the special features of wind and water pollinated plants? They are not colorful and they do not produce nectar. So each and every type of pollen, they have the specific feature, right? So here the wind and water pollinated flowers are not colorful because they need not attract any insect or an animal, and they do not produce any nectar. Okay, so these are the special features of the pollen which are produced by the water pollinated flowers. So the next is the biotic agent, that is by animals. So it is used by majority of the flowering plants. So majority of the flowering plants which are present in the land, they use animals as the pollinating agents. So what are the animals that are involved in pollination? Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, ants, moths, and some birds, that is sunbirds and hummingbirds, bats, primates, then arboreal, that is tree-living rodents, then reptiles like zecco lizard and garden lizard, etc. They all act as a pollinating agent. Okay, so pollination by insects is a more common, particularly by bees. Bees is a common pollinating agent. Okay, because they depend particularly on the nectar, right? So they are the common pollinating agent. And other often flowers of animal pollinated plants are specifically adapted for a particular species of animal. So they are, for example, if you take a mango, they are particularly pollinated by insects, and also even rose, they are pollinated by insects. But banana, if you take, they are pollinated by banana, particularly by bats or birds. So each and every plant, they are pollinated by a specific animal, right? So often flowers of an animal pollinated plants, they are specifically adapted for a particular species of a animal. Okay. So what are the features of the insect pollinated flowers? So they are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. So all these features are there in insect pollinated plants. Why? If they are large, they can attract the insects, and it should be colorful to attract the insect and other animals even, and fragrant, so it should have a good smell, and rich in nectar, so they can come for their food, right? So all these are the features of an insect pollinated flower. So nectar and the pollen grains are the floral rewards for pollination. So since the flowers have nectar and the pollen grains, so that is the easy source for pollination. So it attracts the insects, right? And small flowers, they form inflorescence. So if the flower is very small, they form a group of flowers, right? So they form an inflorescence to make them visible, so that they will be visible and it can attract the insects. So if it is small, so small, the insects will not be attracted, so they form an inflorescence to make them visible. Okay, the flowers pollinated by flies and beetles, they secrete foul odors to attract these animals. Okay, the pollinated by flies and beetles. So first thing is, they may either cause the fragrant, or they produce the odor to attract the animals, or they produce the colorful flowers to attract the insects, right? So these pollen grains are generally sticky. So what is the purpose of the stickiness? So that whatever the insect is coming to the flower, these pollen grains can stick to the surface of that insects, and when the in particular insect, it goes and lands on the different flowers, so there it is transferred to the stigma. So here the pollen grains are generally sticky, right? So when an animal comes in contact with the anther and the stigma, its body gets the pollen grains. So the pollen grains gets attached to the animal's body, right? The pollen grains are generally sticky in animal pollinated flowers. So when it comes in contact with the stigma, it results in pollination. So from one flower, it carries the pollen. So if the insects land on the one flower, so here what happens, the pollen gets attached to the insect body, and when it lands on the another flower, so this pollen is now transferred to the stigma of the another flower, so that results in the pollination. Okay. So some plants, they provide safe places as floral reward to lay eggs. That is what is happening is, some mutual benefit is for the animal and also for the plant. So example is Amarcophallus. So it has the tallest flower of 6 feet. So it helps the animal to lay their eggs. So that helps in pollination. Okay. So another one example is a moth, a particular type of moth. It lives with the plant called yucca. So both of them, they live in a symbiotic association. They cannot complete their life cycle without each other. So both are dependent on each other, right? So the moth deposits its eggs in the locule of the ovary. So what is the moth doing? Because it is providing the safe place for the moth to lay their eggs. So the moth deposits its eggs in the locule of ovary. So in the same time, what is the use for the flower? The flower gets pollinated by the moth. So both are getting benefited. So the larvae that has come out of the eggs as seeds start developing. So whenever here after pollination, there occurs the formation of the seeds. Here the larvae come out of the eggs as seeds start developing. So both are benefited, that is mutually benefited, a moth species and the plant yucca. Okay. So many insects, they consume pollen or nectar without bringing about pollination. So main purpose of these insects is pollination, you're saying, but in some cases they will take the nectar, but that doesn't result in pollination. So they are called the pollen or nectar robbers. Okay, so they are pollen or nectar robbers. So they take the pollen or the nectar, but there is no pollination. Okay, so these are the biotic agents, that is the pollination by animals, and it can be brought about by different animals. Okay, I hope you are clear till now, right? So we saw about the different types of agents of pollination, abiotic factors, wind and water, that is anemophily and hydrophily, and then biotic factors by using the different animals, and each and every thing that is a different type of agent, they will have the different type of the specification regarding the pollen grains, right? So next is the outbreeding devices. So what do you mean by outbreeding devices? Some flowers, that is hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodite means bisexual, right? So they have both the male and the female reproductive structures. So they can undergo self-pollination or autogamy. So if autogamy is continuously happening, what do we see? It leads to inbreeding depression, that is reduction in the fertility rate, right? So continuous self-pollination, it results in inbreeding depression. So some plants, they avoid the self-pollination and they encourage the cross-pollination. So those devices are called the outbreeding devices, right? So this is the self-pollination. So if it is happening within the flower, anther to the stigma, so they will avoid the self-pollination and they encourage the cross-pollination. That is, these anthers are transferred to the stigma of the another flower. Okay, so what are the ways the plants adapt to encourage the cross-pollination? So first one is avoiding synchronization. So what do you mean by avoiding synchronization? So here the pollen is released before the stigma becomes receptive, or the stigma becomes receptive before the pollen or the release of the pollen. So when the pollination will happen, only there must be a synchronization between the release of pollen and the receptivity of the stigma, right? So when there is no synchronization, there will be no transfer. So this process actually is called the dichogamy. So dichogamy means if the male and the female sex organs, that is, they mature at different times. Male and female sex organs mature at different times, right? So here there are two types. One is called protandry and another one is called protogyny. So under protandry, here the anther mature earlier than the stigma. Here the example is sunflower. So protogyny, gyny is here the gynoecium, it matures. That is, the carpels, they mature earlier than the anthers. So the example is mustard. Okay, so the different male and the female sex organ, they mature at a different time. That is called the dichogamy. So they avoid the synchronization. Here the pollen is released before the stigma becomes receptive, or the stigma becomes receptive before the release of pollen. That is called the dichogamy. There are two types. One is protandry and another one is protogyny. Okay, so you're clear? And then the second is the arrangement of anther and stigma at different positions. So if they are not arranged in the same position, that is, if the pollination has to happen, the arrangement should, that is, they should be close to each other. So if they are arranged at the different positions, self-pollination can be avoided. Okay, so the arrangement of anther and stigma at different position, and also that is called heterostale. So they have the anther and stigma at different levels. Okay, and third one is self-incompatibility. or self-sterility. So what do you mean by this self-incompatibility? It is a genetic mechanism to prevent self-pollen from the same flower or the other flowers of the same plant from fertilization by inhibiting the pollen germination or pollen tube growth in the pistil. So how this is happening? It is a genetic mechanism. So if the pollen are from the same flower or from the same plant, there will be no formation of the pollen tube, or the pollen germination will not happen. So it is a results in self-sterility. Okay, so that is one of the factors. Then next is the production of unisexual flowers. So that is one way of avoiding the self-pollination. That is, if both male and the female flowers are present on the same plant, that is monoecious, right? All these terms we saw, right? Monoecious. Then it prevents autogamy, but not zytogamy. If male and the female flowers are present in the same plant, so there will be a separate male flower and the female flower, but they are present on the same plants, here autogamy is prevented. But if you take the dioecious plants, the male and female flowers are present on different plants. That condition is called dioecy. If male and female flowers are present on the different plants, right? So this prevents both autogamy and zytonogamy, because zytonogamy is the same plant will not have the male and the female flowers, right? So it also prevents the zytonogamy. But if you take this monoecious condition, here the male and female flowers are present in the same plant, so it can lead to zytonogamy. So production of the unisexual flowers is one of the factor that lead to the, that is it avoid the self-pollination, and it encourages the cross-pollination. Okay, so this condition is also called dicliny. So I hope you are clear with it, right? Any doubts on this? So we saw about the different types of pollination, and about the agents of pollination, and about the outbreeding devices. That is, what are the strategies that the plants adapt to avoid the self-pollination and to encourage the cross-pollination, because the self-pollination leads to inbreeding, depression leads to reduction in the fertility rate, right? So these are the factors that are adapted by the plants. So we'll discuss few questions. The pollination by snail and slug is known as Ornithophilus, Chiropterophilus, Entomophilus, Malacophilus. Zytonogamy, yeah, we'll see. Yeah, this is the zytonogamy. That is, it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. So actually the plant is same within the same plant. That is, the same plant will have two flowers. So this is one flower and this is another flower, right? So here what is happening? Transfer of pollen grain from anther of this flower is transferred to the stigma of the another flower within the same plant. Okay, so this is called the zytonogamy. Clear? So only cross-pollination is possible. It is functionally a cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent, but genetically if you see, both are from the same plant, so they will be similar. So if it is an autogamy, it will be within this, that is the same flower, and that is the pollen is transferred from anther to the stigma, right? So this is autogamy. So clear now? Yeah. So if it is an xenogamy means, sorry, yeah, I can see in this picture also. So this is autogamy, and this is zytonogamy, and this is xenogamy to a different plant. Both the plants are different here. Okay. So pollination by snail and slug is known as, yeah, D is the right answer. That is Malacophilus. Zytonogamy is functionally cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent. Genetically, it is similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. Functionally and genetically, it is autogamy. Both A and D are correct. Yeah, D is the correct option here. So both A and B are right. So cross-pollination, it is a cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent. It is genetically similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. Functionally and genetically, it is autogamy. It is not the, it is different. Functionally, it is actually autogamy is within the same flower, but here within the same plant. So both A and B are correct. So which of the following is false about xenogamy? It is the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma of another plant of the same species. It produces genetic variation. It is genetically and ecologically cross-pollination. It occurs in Clistogamous class. So which is false about xenogamy? Xenogamy. Yes, D is right. Because all these are correct option. That is, it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of another plant of same species. It produces genetic variation. It is genetically and ecologically cross-pollination, but it occurs in Clistogamous flowers is a wrong option because Clistogamous flowers are always closed and only autogamy is possible in the case of Clistogamous flowers, but xenogamy is not possible. So D is the right option. Autogamy is transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of another flower, pollination between two flowers, maturation of anther and stigma at different times. Yeah, A is the right answer. The term pollination signifies dehiscence of anther, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower, formation of pollinia. So what is the right option here? Yes, B is the right answer. That is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Which of the following devices is not used by plants to prevent autogamy? Self-incompatibility, production of unisexual flower, heterostyle, and production of Clistogamous flowers. So which of the following devices is not used by plants to prevent autogamy? Yeah, D is the right answer. So all these are the devices used by the plants to prevent self-pollination and to promote the cross-pollination. But production of Clistogamous flowers is not the way because this always leads to autogamy. Okay. So we'll see a few more questions. So state the false statement regarding the Clistogamous class. They do not open at all and anthers and stigma lie close to each other. And option B, when anthers dehisce in the flower buds, pollen grains meet stigma for pollination. Clistogamous flowers produce assured seed sac even in the absence of pollinators. And option D, Clistogamy can prevent inbreeding depression. So which is the false statement regarding the Clistogamous flowers? Among these four statements, which one is the false statement? Yeah, D is the right answer because Clistogamy can prevent inbreeding depression, it is given. But the thing is, Clistogamy, it leads to autogamy and it leads to inbreeding depression and it cannot. Actually, it is given as it can prevent, so it is a wrong statement, right? So D is the right option. Which of the following sets of plants can produce both Chasmogamous and Clistogamous flowers? It is Helianthus, Oxalis, and Camelina, Viola, Oxalis, and Camelina, Then option C, Gossypium, Oxalis and Helianthus. Option D, Oxalis rosa and Gossypium. Yes, it is option B, that is Viola, Oxalis and Camelina. So here these, they produce both chasmogamous and clistogamous. Okay, so option B is the right answer. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of same plant is called chasmogamy, autogamy, zytonogamy, and xenogamy. Yes, see, that is zytonogamy. You read the words clearly, whether it is from the same plant or the different plants. So based on that, you have to write the type of pollination. Okay, so here it is zytonogamy. Most common abiotic pollination is anemophily, hydrophily, chirophily, entomophily. Yes, it is anemophily, that is wind pollination is the more common abiotic pollination. In water hyacinth and water lily, pollination takes place by option E, hydrophily and anemophily, option B, entomophily and anemophily, option C, anemophily and ornithophily, D, only hydrophily. So which is the right option? In water hyacinth and water lily. Water hyacinth and water lily. The pollination takes place by option A, it is hydrophily and anemophily, option B, entomophily and anemophily, anemophily and ornithophily, and only hydrophily. So the correct option is option B, that is entomophily and anemophily. So by wind and by insects in the case of water hyacinth and water lily. Okay. The need to produce enormous amount of pollen when compared to number of ovule available for pollination is option A, to protect young pollens, to attract insect, and option C, to compensate for the uncertainties and loss of pollen grain, option D, to compensate the aging of pollen. So what is the right option? Yeah, C is the right option, to compensate for uncertainties and loss of pollen grains. So there occurs in production of enormous amount of pollen. Okay. Pollination by water, actually it happens in, it's limited up about 30 genera, mostly monocotyledons, and option B, 30 genera, mostly dicotyledons, and option C, about 10 genera, mostly monocotyledons, and option D, about 10 genera, mostly dicotyledons. So which is the right option? That is option A. Yeah, it's right, 30 genera, and mostly it is monocot, right? Mostly monocotyledons. Then pollen tube, it enters the ovule through the micropyle and then enters one of the synergids through antipodals, chalaza, filiform apparatus, and pollen kit. Yeah, see, through the filiform apparatus, right? So the pollen tube, it enters the ovule through the micropyle and then it enters one of the synergids through filiform apparatus. Which of the following is not the feature of insect pollinated flowers? So you have to be clear for these type of questions, right? So which of the following is not the feature of insect pollinated flowers? First is the large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. Option B, small flowers form inflorescence to make them visible. Option C, the flowers pollinated by flies and beetles secrete foul odors to attract these animals. Option D, pollen grains are generally non-sticky. So which is not the feature is option D, because first three, they are the features of the insect pollinated flowers. But the insect pollinated flowers, they usually the pollen grains are sticky, but here it is given as non-sticky. So D is the right option. Then a moth species deposits its egg in the locule of ovary of which plant? Amorphophilus, Gossypium oxalis, and Yucca. Yes, Yucca. There occurs a symbiotic relationship between a moth and a Yucca. That is, moth deposits its egg, and Yucca, it gets pollinated by the moth, right? So Yucca is the right answer. That is option B. So which one of the following is not included in outbreeding devices? Avoiding synchronization, arrangement of anther and stigma at different positions, self-incompatibility, production of bisexual flowers. So which is the right option here? Is again option D, that is the production of bisexual flowers, because that is actually not included. The production of unisexual flowers is only included under the outbreeding devices, right? So option D is the right answer. Then megasporangium along with the protective integument is called ovary, ovule, funicle, and chalaza. Megasporangium along with its protective integuments is called ovary, ovule, funicle, and chalaza. Yeah, B is the right answer. So megasporangium is also called the ovule, and it is having a protective integuments. Then the next, a typical angiospermous ovule is attached to the placenta by means of a stalk called funicle, hilum, micropyle, and chalaza. A typical angiospermous ovule is attached to the placenta by means of a stalk called funicle, hilum, micropyle, and chalaza. Case A is the right answer. The stalk is called the funicle. Okay. Then the next question. The body of the ovule fuses with funicle in the region called hilum, funicle, chalaza, and micropyle. Is again it is option A, it is hilum. The body of the ovule fuses with the funicle in a region called hilum. Female gametophyte of a typical dicot at the time of fertilization is 8-celled, 7-celled, 6-celled, or 5-celled. The female gametophyte of a typical dicot at the time of fertilization is 8-celled, 7-celled, 6-celled, or 5-celled. Is the correct answer is option B, that is 7-celled. We saw, right, the structure of the embryo sac. It is 7-celled and 8-nucleated. Okay, so B is the right answer. So I hope you are clear with it, right? So any doubts? Have any doubts in this? So with this, we completed the pollination, and then the next class on Monday, we'll see about the fertilization, right? So how the fusion is happening. So we saw about the pre-fertilization events, and now under pollination, so how the transfer is happening, right? Both the male and female gametes are non-motile, so they are brought together by means of the various pollinating agents. That's what we saw today. Then we'll see about the fertilization and then post-fertilization events. Okay, so clear with it? So you go through it, and if you have any doubts in the previous classes, like sexual reproduction in flowering plants, clear? Okay. Okay, then read through it and practice more questions. Okay. Okay, then. Thank you.